what I think is a much bigger threat to the royal family than Andrew, because whereas Andrew has destroyed himself, Meghan and Harry still have a long way to go before they completely self-destruct.
Stop. Stop scrolling. Stop whatever you were about to do in the next 10 seconds. Because Tom Bower has just openly committed to print the single sharpest line about Harry that any credentialed investigative biographer has put on the record in years. The line is direct. Harry and Meghan are, by his published assessment, a considerably bigger threat to the royal family than the former Prince Andrew. Read that line again. The credentialed investigative biographer who has spent the past 4 years documenting the inside of the post-royal household, whose books on the subject are now treated as the foundational text on which the wider royal commentary world is drawing, has openly placed the younger son above the disgraced brother on the league table of operational damage being done to the institution. The reasoning by Bower's published reading is brutally clean. Andrew, in his published phrasing, has already destroyed himself. The damage is done, the trajectory is settled. The former prince is, in plain operational terms, in internal exile, with the wider press cycle on him now essentially limited to the question of whether the criminal investigation will or will not reach a courtroom. The Sussex household, by contrast, has a long way to go before it completely self-destructs. The descent is, in his exact published phrasing, ongoing. The next round of damage is, by every available reading of the present moment, still to come. The audience watching the trajectory has, in operational terms, considerably more material still to witness. Tonight, we are walking through Bower's published verdict, beat by beat. Why he is the figure whose verdict carries this weight in the first place. Why Harry has, in his published reading, now overtaken Andrew on the institutional damage league table. The Andrew investigation and the evidentiary difficulty the prosecutors are actually facing. The Sandringham proximity question. The York princesses question, and the published view that has now openly landed on the future of their titles. Let us start with Bower himself, because the wider royal commentary world does not, as a rule, treat every published commentator with the same level of attention. Bower is the exception. The reason is the underlying record. Tom Bower has spent his entire publishing career as a serious investigative biographer of major British public figures. The subjects he has chosen to write about have included some of the most powerful figures in modern British public life. The methodology he has used has been, by every available reading of his published record, the methodology of a working investigative journalist. Documentary research, original interviews, the patient assembly of receipts that turn anonymous gossip into citable published reporting. The books he produces are not, by any honest reading, the casual celebrity biographies that the wider publishing industry produces in significant volume each year. They are the kind of book that ends up in libel courts being defended on the strength of the underlying documentary record, and that, across his entire career, has been defended successfully. Revenge, his first major book on the post-royal household, was the book that openly laid out for the first time in a single published volume the underlying operational architecture of the original Sussex departure and the years that followed. Betrayal, his second, has now landed at the moment the household itself has visibly entered the most difficult operational stretch of its entire post-royal trajectory. The book has, by every available reading of the published coverage, drawn the kind of immediate defensive response from the household that is the cleanest possible signal of how close to the operational bone the book has actually gone. The wider operation accused the author of having a position. The wider operation suggested the facts were not straight. The wider operation, in plain terms, did not produce a published rebuttal capable of standing up to the underlying documentary record. The book, in operational terms, stands. There is also a wider observation worth making about the kind of reporting Bower actually does, because the methodology matters. The wider celebrity press, in the modern publishing industry, generally operates on the basis of single-source interviews, anonymous palace briefings, and the kind of warm, cooperative access that produces the published profiles the wider audience reads each week in the supermarket magazines. Bower does not. by every available reading of his published record, operate on that basis. The interviews he conducts are conducted on his own terms, not on the terms of the household being profiled. The documentary research is undertaken independently, not through the household's chosen public relations channels. That is the reason Bauer's published verdict carries the weight it carries. He is the working investigative biographer whose published reporting on the household is now the foundational text on which the wider royal commentary world is drawing. So, when Bauer openly places Harry above Andrew on the Institutional Damage League table, the wider commentary community reads it as a marker. And the marker that has now landed is the sharpest one the published commentary world has produced on the post-royal household in years. Now to the line itself, because the line is the headline of the entire week of royal commentary. Bauer's published phrasing is direct. Andrew, in his published reading, has already destroyed himself. The Sussex household has, in his exact published wording, a long way to go before it completely self-destructs. The damage being done to the institution by the disgraced brother is, by Bauer's published view, a closed chapter. The damage being done by the younger son and his wife is still, in plain operational terms, an open one. The reasoning underneath the line is worth pausing on, because the reasoning is what makes the line carry the weight it carries. The former Prince Andrew is, by every available reading of his current operational position, in what the wider commentary now openly calls internal exile. He no longer represents the family at public events. He no longer holds the senior military honorary roles that were stripped from him years ago. He no longer carries the royal patronages he once held. He cannot, by every available reading of the institutional architecture around him, return to public life in any operational sense. The wider press cycle on him has, by every available reading of the published coverage, essentially narrowed to the single question of whether the criminal investigation will or will not reach a courtroom. The wider institutional damage he is capable of doing to the working royal family has, in operational terms, already been done. The audience watching him is, in the cold reading of the wider press cycle, waiting for one of two outcomes. Either the prosecutors bring charges, or they do not. After that, by Bauer's published view, the chapter on the former prince effectively closes. The Sussex household, by Bauer's published reading, is in a fundamentally different position. The descent is, in his exact phrasing, ongoing. The household is still, in plain operational terms, producing new visible content each week. The household is still drawing the wider press cycle around itself on a routine basis. The household is still, by every available reading of its present commercial pipeline, attempting to generate the next operational opportunity to maintain its commercial relevance. Each new attempt produces, in the published reading, the next round of operational difficulty, the wedding photograph carousel, the British Airways card, the Geneva speech, the Bondi Beach overlay, the Disneyland photographs. Each new visible move generates the next round of published commentary about the underlying operating pattern, and each new round of published commentary, by every available reading of the wider press cycle, adds to the accumulated weight of the institutional damage now visible. The wider published reading is that the Sussex household is, in operational terms, the brand that will not stop generating its own next news cycle. Andrew, by contrast, is, in operational terms, the brand that has, by every available reading of the past several years, gone quiet. The damage from the quiet brand is, by Bauer's published view, a finite quantity. The damage from the loud brand is, by his published reading, an ongoing one. The institution can, in the long view, absorb the finite damage. The institution is, by Bauer's published assessment, considerably more concerned about the ongoing one. There is also a wider point worth making about the underlying nature of the damage in each case. Andrew, by every available reading of the published coverage, has produced damage of a single kind. The historical association with the late Jeffrey Epstein, the catastrophic BBC Newsnight interview, the civil settlement with the late Virginia Giuffre. The wider scandal that has, across years, produced repeated press cycles on the same underlying material. The Sussex household, by Bauer's published assessment, produces damage of multiple kinds. The published interviews, the Netflix programming, the Spare memoir, the Oprah Winfrey conversation, the published statements on contested international subjects, the ongoing legal actions against British public bodies, the wider commercial activities that increasingly draw on the original royal architecture for their marketing materials. Each piece of damage, on its own, would be manageable. The cumulative weight of all of them, landing over a sustained period, is, by Bowers' published reading, the larger institutional concern. The closing piece of the published reading is the time horizon. Andrew is, by every available reading of his current position, no longer producing new material. The Sussex household, by Bowers' published view, is producing new material continuously. The audience watching the institution will, in the long view, see more of the second pattern than the first. And the institution, in operational terms, will spend more of its working attention managing the second than the first. That is the published verdict. The credentialed investigative biographer at the center of tonight's coverage has now committed the verdict to print, and the wider royal commentary world has read it as the marker it is. Now to the Andrew situation itself, because the Andrew situation is the piece of the wider royal landscape that has moved further forward this week. The published reporting is that the former Prince Andrew is, as of the past several days, under active investigation by the Metropolitan Police in relation to allegations of sexual misconduct dating from a period around 2010. The investigation, by every available reading of the published coverage, is being taken seriously at the highest levels of British policing. The wider press cycle has been dominated across the past several days by coverage of how the king is handling the situation. Bowers' published reading on the criminal case itself is direct, and it is the kind of reading that only an investigative biographer with decades of experience reading similar cases would actually commit to print. The case may, in the cold operational reality of what the police are facing, prove genuinely difficult to bring to a courtroom. The reason, by his published assessment, is evidentiary. The single-named public complainant against the former prince, across the entire span of the years of allegations, has been the late Virginia Giuffre. No other woman has, by Bowers' published reading, come forward in her own name with a comparable account of being personally subjected to the kind of conduct that would form the basis of a criminal case. The reasons for that, by Bowers' published commentary, are entirely understandable. Women who may have personal accounts of difficult experiences from that period may, by every available reading of how these cases actually unfold, prefer to maintain their own privacy rather than to step into the wider press exposure that any criminal proceedings would involve. The published position of the prosecutors, by Bowers' reading, is therefore difficult. The wider public pressure for accountability is real. The available evidentiary base to support a criminal case may, in plain operational terms, be narrower than the public pressure assumes. The result, by Bowers' published prediction, may well be that the criminal investigation proceeds for some considerable period without producing the kind of formal charges the wider public expects. If the case is ultimately not brought, the published warning is that the public reaction will be significant. The wider public will, by every available reading, conclude that the former prince has, in the social phrase, been allowed to escape the consequences of conduct that has been the subject of years of reporting and a substantial civil settlement. The wider royal commentary point about the king's posture is sharp. The king is, by every available reading of the recent published coverage, deliberately keeping his distance from his brother. The decision is not, in the published reading, a personal one. It is a constitutional one. Criminal prosecutions in the United Kingdom are brought, in technical terms, under the authority of the sovereign. Any visible interaction between the king and his brother, while the brother is under active criminal investigation, would, by every available reading of the wider British constitutional framework, risk being read as interference in the investigation itself. The same constitutional consideration applied earlier in the reign, when the king declined to receive his son Harry during the period in which Harry was actively litigating against the Home Office for personal protection arrangements. The principle in both cases is the same. The sovereign cannot, in operational terms, be seen to be interacting with family members who are involved in active legal proceedings under the sovereign's own authority. There is also a wider published thread now openly running on the future of the Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie position within the institution, and it has, in the past several months, become considerably sharper than it was a year ago. The published view from the biographer Andrew Lowney is that both princesses should, in the long view, give up their titles, along with the apartments they reportedly occupy within St. James's Palace. Bower's own published position on this question has now visibly shifted. His earlier published view had been that the sins of the parents should not be visited on the children. The position he has now openly committed to print is that the daughters have, by his own published assessment, exploited their titles for personal financial benefit in ways that he had not, at the time of his earlier reporting, fully appreciated. The wider commentary point centers on the published reporting that both princesses voluntarily traveled to visit the late Jeffrey Epstein after his original release from custody as a registered sex offender. The decision to make that visit, by every available reading of the wider published coverage, is one that has continued to attract criticism across the years that have followed. The wider published reporting on the broader financial relationships within the wider York family has also, across the past several years, produced consistent questions about gifts, sponsorships, and arrangements whose underlying terms have not always been made fully transparent to the wider public. The published view that has now landed is that the wider royal family may, in the long view, have to draw a line on the wider York family question. The published observation is that the Prince and Princess of Wales, by every available reading of their own thinking, may indeed favor exactly that line being drawn. The published assessment is that both daughters have, in plain operational terms, been instructed to maintain a low public profile, with the understanding that further public attention will produce further consequences. The wider institutional question is when and how the formal step would be taken in a moment that is already saturated with other royal family difficulties. And there is one further piece of the published reading worth recording. The wider Sarah Duchess of York side of the family is, by every available reading of the published coverage, in significant operational difficulty. The wider public sympathy for the former Duchess, by Bower's published reading, has now substantially evaporated. The published question, openly raised in the conversation that produced tonight's coverage, is whether she will eventually attempt to write her own published account of the recent years as a route to income. The published verdict is that her best operational option, in the meantime, is to stay quietly out of the wider public eye. Now to the visible pivot in the wider Sussex public relations operation, because the past several months have produced one of the cleanest course corrections in the household's entire post-royal communications history. The senior communications director, Meredith Maines, departed the Sussex operation earlier this year. The departure was, by every available reading of the published coverage, not entirely amicable. What has followed across the months since has been, by the published reading, a visible shift in the framing the household has chosen to project to the wider American audience. The earlier public relations posture, characterized by serious institutional speeches and the wider attempt to position the household as a credible humanitarian voice, has been quietly supplemented by a softer, warmer, more family-oriented register. Photographs of Meghan with the children at theme parks. Carousel posts featuring scenes of domestic warmth. The wider Mother of the Year framing, in the language of the wider American celebrity press, the pivot is, in operational terms, the kind of strategic reset that any seasoned public relations operation will recognize on sight. The earlier framing was not, by every available reading of the engagement metrics, working. The audience that responds to serious institutional speeches was not, by every available signal of the wider polling, the audience the household was actually reaching. The audience that responds to softer family content is, by every available reading of the platform engagement metrics, a considerably larger and more reliable audience for a personal brand operation. The shift, in plain operational terms, is the household chasing where the metrics actually live. Bower's published reading is that the pivot was timed almost exactly to the release of his own second major book on the household. The book itself, by the published view, landed at the precise moment the household was already in the process of executing the wider public relations reset. The wider effect, by every available reading of how the past several months have unfolded, has been that the softer family content has been operating against the backdrop of considerably harder published material in the wider commentary world. The two operate, in plain operational terms, on different timescales. The softer content drives the immediate engagement metrics on the social platforms. The harder published material drives the wider long-term reading of the household across the British and American press. The Bondi Beach moment that landed alongside the wider artificial intelligence app launch is the cleanest possible test case of how the wider pivot has, in some cases, produced significant operational difficulties of its own. The wider published reporting was that Meghan attended a charitable event in support of cancer survivors and survivors of the Bondi Beach incident, a real and serious public tragedy that affected real families across the wider Australian community. While at that event, the published reading is that the wider As Ever brand operation simultaneously launched the artificial intelligence shopping app feature that allowed wider audiences to purchase the clothing Meghan was wearing in the published footage. The result, by every available reading of how the wider press cycle landed, was a visible commercial overlay sitting directly on top of footage of cancer survivors and victims of a public tragedy. Bauer's published verdict on the moment is, in his exact published phrasing, that it was gross, it was insensitive. But it showed by his published reading the real underlying operating pattern of the household. Anything for the dime, anything for the personal publicity, anything for the next news cycle to be filled with branded content. The Texas school shooting moment from earlier in the post-royal era is, by Bauer's published reading, the cleanest possible historical parallel. Meghan was, by every available reading of the published coverage, photographed laying flowers at a memorial for the victims of the Uvalde school shooting in the days that followed the tragedy. The published commentary observation is that the visit took place at a moment when her own father was, by every available reading of the wider reporting, recovering from a near-fatal stroke. The wider published reading is that the operational priorities visible in that moment told the wider audience exactly what they needed to know about the underlying calculation. The personal publicity that came with appearing at the Texas Memorial was, in the published assessment, prioritized over the family relationship that, by every available reading of how families ordinarily function, would have been expected to draw the principal's attention. The pattern, by Bauer's published reading, is consistent. The pattern, by Bauer's published reading, is documented across the entire post-royal era. There is also a wider commercial point worth recording on the underlying operating model because Bauer's published assessment of the wider Sussex commercial pipeline is direct. The household is, by his published reading, no longer earning what it once earned. The original Spotify arrangement is gone. The original Netflix architecture has, by every available reading of the recent published coverage, been substantially restructured. The wider commercial pipeline of major announced projects has, by every available reading of the published commentary, repeatedly failed to produce the deliverables originally promised. The romance feature based on the popular book was announced approximately 3 years ago and has not appeared. The Polo scripted series has not, by every available signal, moved into production. The Afghanistan feature project, the most credible single piece of intellectual property the production company has attached its name to in years, is now the project Netflix needs the household to actually deliver. The operation, by Bauer's published assessment, is therefore now poorly financed. The wider activity visible across the public platforms, in his published phrasing, is no longer about expansion. It is about survival. Now to the wider Invictus Games situation. Because the operational picture for the Birmingham Games next year has become significantly more complicated across the past several weeks. The basic context is that the Invictus Games are scheduled to be held in Birmingham in the year 2027. The traditional Invictus pattern is that the principal makes a tease appearance in the host city approximately a year before the games themselves take place. Harry is, by every available reading of the published coverage, expected to make that tease appearance in the United Kingdom this summer. The operational picture sitting around that expected visit has, in the past several weeks, become considerably more complicated than it was a year ago. The first complication is the leadership question. A senior member of the Invictus Games Board of Trustees has, by published reporting, recently stepped down from her vice chairman role. The departure, by every available reading of the wider coverage, was not entirely amicable. The wider operational reading is that experienced institutional figures who have spent significant time inside the underlying governance architecture of the Games are now openly choosing to leave rather than continue inside the present operational arrangement. That is, in the cold language of charitable institutional governance, a serious signal. Experienced trustees do not generally walk away from working charitable boards without reason. The second complication is the sponsorship question. Major sponsors of the Games, including the aerospace company Boeing, are reportedly reconsidering their financial commitments to the wider operation. The financial architecture of the Birmingham Games, by the published reading, may now require considerably more institutional support from the British government and the wider sponsor community than was originally anticipated. Sponsors who reconsider their commitments to major sporting events do so by every available reading of how corporate philanthropy actually works, for reasons that the wider operation would prefer not to see published. The Boeing question is, in that sense, the most visible signal of a wider commercial reconsideration that may, in the long view, prove difficult to reverse. The wider published parallel that has now openly landed in the commentary is the parallel to the Centibale collapse earlier in the year. The wider Centibale charity, which Harry co-founded in 2006 in support of children affected by the wider health and welfare crisis in southern Africa, was the subject of significant published reporting earlier in the year, in which the wider board governance of the charity came under sustained criticism. The founder's chair stepped down. The wider operational architecture, by every available reading of the published coverage, was substantially restructured. The wider published verdict was that the underlying operational pattern at Centibale was the same operational pattern visible across the wider Sussex household. Charitable institutional integrity colliding with personal brand demands. The institutional side losing ground. The wider charitable mission becoming progressively less able to function under the pressure of the brand demands attached to it. The wider Bauer published parallel is that the Invictus operation may, in the long view, find itself heading toward the same kind of institutional crisis. The Boeing sponsorship question is the most visible immediate test. The leadership departures are the second. The wider commercial appeal of the Games, once the principal's wider press profile has settled into its current pattern, is the third. Any one of these questions, in isolation, would be manageable for a working charity with a stable institutional architecture. All three landing in the same calendar period against the backdrop of a principal whose own public profile is producing the kind of press coverage Harry's is now producing, represent the kind of compounding operational pressure that, by every available reading of how charitable institutions actually function, tends to produce significant structural difficulty over time. Now to the wider Geneva moment, because Bauer's published verdict on it has now openly landed. The Geneva speech earlier in the month is, by Bauer's published reading, the cleanest possible case study in the wider operational difficulty the household is now facing. The principal flew across the world. The crash barriers were prepared. The wider operational architecture was readied. The audience, by every available reading of the published footage, simply did not arrive. The square was thinly attended. The local press did not lead with the event. The wider international community did not, by every available signal, take the visit seriously. Bauer's published phrasing on the moment is the kind of phrasing only an investigative biographer with decades of experience would actually commit to print. The principal, in his exact published wording, flew all the way to Switzerland, clearly for a fee, to deliver an inane and purposeless speech on a subject she has, by his published assessment, very little of substance to add to. The reason, by his published reading, that she keeps returning to variations on the same subject is the simplest possible one. There is, by his published reading, nothing else she has to say. The verdict is sharp. It is also, by every honest reading of the published video evidence from the square, difficult to dispute. The principle is no longer, by every available reading of the present moment, drawing the audience the wider commercial operation needs her to draw. The Sydney engagement earlier in the calendar produced the same operational result. The wider American media tour earlier in the year produced similar engagement metrics. The pattern is consistent. The pattern is now openly documented in Bauer's published reporting. And the wider published verdict is that the principle is, in plain operational terms, running out of venues that are willing to host the operation under the original terms the operation once commanded. Now to the wider anniversary content, because Bauer's published reading of it sits inside the same operational pattern. The household published a carousel of previously unseen photographs from the original 2018 wedding day to mark the 8th anniversary. Bauer's published commentary on the carousel is direct. The principal, who for years has built a substantial part of her wider personal brand on the published claim that she requires personal privacy, has now openly published the most private possible photographs from her own wedding day to drive the next round of social media engagement metrics. The contradiction, by every available reading of his published phrasing, is hard to miss. The brand that was originally constructed on the demand for privacy is now actively monetizing the personal photographs the demand for privacy was supposed to protect. The British Airways card that landed in the same news cycle is, by Bauer's published reading, the same operational pattern in compressed form. The card itself was, by the airline's own published policy, a pre-orderable customer service feature. The wider exclusive that landed in People magazine, presenting the card as a spontaneous gesture from a personally moved cabin crew, did not, by every available reading of the underlying published policy, hold together on contact with the airline's own website. The receipts on the policy landed within hours of the original post. The wider published verdict was that the principal had, in plain operational terms, been caught attempting to manufacture spontaneous celebrity adoration out of routine published customer service. The wider commentary read was that the household had reached the operational moment at which even basic public relations stunts of this kind are now being identified openly in real time. Bauer's wider published reading on the underlying pattern is unflinching. The principal is, in his exact published phrasing, a publicity junkie. The operational pattern, by his published reading, is the routine of a person who calculates, on roughly a weekly cycle, that she has not been visible enough in the wider news cycle, and who then produces, in whatever form is operationally available, the next visible piece of content. The daughter at the principal's feet in the closet photograph, the jam product launch, the previously unseen wedding photographs, the British Airways card, the Geneva trip itself, by his published reading, was the same operational pattern executed at international scale. And the wider commercial difficulty visible underneath the entire content cycle is, by his published reading, the as-ever jam stockpile that no one is actually buying. The published reporting is that significant quantities of the original product line are now sitting in storage in unspecified locations, unable to find the consumer audience the original launch had anticipated. That is, in the cold language of consumer brand operations, the kind of inventory difficulty that drives most lifestyle brand operations to operational restructuring within the first 2 to 3 years of launch. The original as-ever jam launch was, by every available reading of the published coverage, treated by the household as the cornerstone product of the wider lifestyle brand. The marketing was extensive. The press coverage was carefully managed. The launch event was given the full operational attention of the wider Sussex communications operation. The wider consumer response was, by every available reading of the subsequent published commentary, considerably weaker than the original marketing had anticipated. The product was made. The product was not bought. The product is, by every available reading, now sitting in storage, awaiting the next round of brand operations to determine what is done with it. So this is the picture as Bauer has now openly framed it. The closing line of his published commentary, in the conversation that produced tonight's coverage, is the kind of line that defines an entire trajectory in a single sentence. The principal, by his published view, has made a strategic error from which the wider current operational difficulty has flowed. Had she remained inside the original institutional arrangement, she would, by his published assessment, have been a much-loved member of the working royal family. She would have opened a hospital. She would have appeared at a children's clinic. She would, on a few occasions each year, have attended the major institutional events. Harry would have retained the original popularity that the original royal architecture had carefully built around him. Both halves of the couple would have had a comfortable, respected, and institutionally protected life inside the wider working royal arrangement. The decision to leave that arrangement is, by the published view, the strategic error from which the wider current operational difficulty originally flowed. And the wider published prediction, openly committed to print, is that the descent of the post-royal household will, in the long view, continue to be considerably more interesting to watch than the original ascent ever was. Andrew, in his published phrasing, has already destroyed himself. The Sussex household, by his published reading, still has a long way to go before it completely self-destructs. The audience watching the trajectory has, in plain operational terms, the more interesting half of the story still ahead of it. Stay sharp, stay watching. Because the story that began at a royal wedding 7 years ago is, by every honest reading, only just entering the chapter that everybody else has been able to see coming for a very, very long time. The Andrew investigation will run its course. The Invictus Birmingham question will resolve itself across the coming months. The Sussex household will produce the next visible content within days. And the published verdict from the most experienced investigative biographer of the post-royal household working today will only continue to clarify. I will see you very soon.